For a lot of people, 2020 has been the worst year they have ever experienced. But for me personally, it's maybe my top 5 worst years ever. Which I realize how outlandish that sounds. It's not even, like, for me personally, the number 1 worst year. And I realize how outlandish that statement may be. But in a few minutes, I will be explaining to you about one of the most traumatizing years of my entire life. And to be able to set the scene a little bit better, I have to first mention I have been in several very traumatizing accidents throughout my entire life. Like, my life could have been written to be Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate events. One of the biggest things for me is I need to explain more on how I got myself into this situation and how it ended up affecting me long term. So, to kind of just put a little bow on the top of this present of how I would like to explain, is my family went to Florida for spring break in 2012. We were there planning on being there for about 2 weeks. And on the second day of our trip, started off like any normal day. We started off by eating breakfast, getting ready, and then we decided to go down and hang out by the pool on our resort's property. And this pool was the coolest thing I have probably ever seen. There was water slides and a lazy river and this big, beautiful pool. About 5 minutes within being there, I met a new friend. His name was Daniel. He was about my age, had a twin brother. Him and I quickly separated from our families, began hanging out, and about halfway through the day, we decided, hey, let's go hang out in the lazy river. So we grabbed our inner tubes, and we started floating in the lazy river. The lazy river was super fun. We ended up trying to walk upwards and backwards around this pool's current. Eventually, we got tired, and it was long. It was a long, hot, sunny day in Florida. And at this point, we decided we just wanted to lounge, hang out in the inner tubes that we had brought into the pool with us, and go around. So I'm letting my hand drag around around in the pool beside me. And all of a sudden, my hand gets swept into this metal light fixture that's about 18 inches wide, but it's broken. And due to the current, my hand got swept inside and it severed the tip of my finger. The first thing I remember doing after that is screaming my head off about my finger being gone and going up to the front desk and being like, I need help. I need you to call 911. At this point, a woman had come over and realized that I was panicking and I was not around my family. So the guy eventually says, I don't think we can call the ambulance since we cannot find your family. So he doesn't end up calling until they find my family. And it took about 30 minutes to find my family as I'm bleeding profusely from my severed finger. After the ambulance finally arrives, about an hour later, because we were probably about 45 minutes away from the nearest hospital, and it ended up being a car accident on the same day that delayed my transportation to the hospital. By the time they found my family and I got my IV, my mom went with me in the ambulance to the hospital as my dad and my brothers followed close behind. And about this point, my body started going into shock. So bits and pieces of my memory are kind of fuzzy and are no longer in my, are able to be recalled quickly. But there were a series of very unfortunate events that followed along after that. The first thing to go wrong is the pump that was giving me my morphine and my saline ended up breaking and started sucking the blood out of my body instead of making me stay hydrated and helping me in that situation long term. Eventually a nurse came in, realized that it was broken, and just fix the pump and pretend like nothing had ever happened. But at this point, I was very, I had very little blood in my system. I was in some pretty serious shock. Wasn't the best situation. After that had happened, an ER doctor had come in on how to reconstruct my finger because it did completely sever everything, like all of the muscle and bone off of my finger. And no, they never did find my fingertips. So if you ever go to Florida, I'd greatly appreciate it if you bring back my finger. I'd miss it dearly. But they ended up using the wrong kind of stitches when they were doing the reconstruction surgery on my hand. So instead of using dissolvable stitches that my skin would have just grown over and it wouldn't have been a big deal long term, they ended up using regular stitches so that when my skin regrew over these stitches, they had to recut open my finger to remove all of my stitches, and I probably had close to 175 stitches in my hand from where it started cutting my hand and my finger off. At the end of this horrible, terrible, awful day, I finally got to go back home to the hotel that we were staying at. And when I got there, I was super tired and exhausted, and I just wanted to go to bed. It was a very traumatic event for me. And when we pull up, there's a little goodie basket from the hotel sitting on the front step of our room. And the hotels had candies and movies and cute little kid goodie basket kind of stuff. And they had a card. So when I opened the card, and I'm not even remotely kidding on what this card says, because this card is a memory that I will never forget. The card said, "We are sorry for your inconvenience. Here's a free manicure." To the kid who literally just lost one of their fingers. Long term, this affected me a lot. I was bullied a little bit for it, just kids being mean because it was different. It was something that they weren't used to. For the life of me, I cannot type the letter W because my finger is just not long enough. The recovery process for it was a lot. It was a very traumatic event for me, but throughout all of this horrible, terrible things that had happened, I learned how strong I am as a person and that bad things will happen no matter who you are. And to this day, this is still a very traumatic event for me. It's something I can talk about freely, and it doesn't affect me that way, but some of the long-term stuff that ended up happening was I can no longer feel half of my left hand. I get phantom pains, which is not something I would ever wish upon anyone. But at the end of the day, you have to learn how to overcome all of these awful things that have happened, and just realize that tomorrow's a new day and you have to look on the bright side. For me, this was probably the worst year of my entire life. It was probably a 2 or 3 year recovery process afterwards, just being able to relearn how to use my hand since I can't feel it, and all of the other long-term affecting stuff that came along with it. But at first glance, you would never know that there was a severe, awful thing that had ever happened to me. And in the long run, that's how 2020 is going to be too. It's going to be something that's in the history books after this is all over, and no one's going to really talk about it. And that's just how things are. Just when you look at someone, you have to realize, even if they look normal, they are not even remotely close to what meets the eye.